May 20, 1941. Dawn breaks over the Mediterranean island of Crete. The morning quiet shatters as hundreds of German aircraft fill the sky, bombers, fighters, and transport planes carrying the Fallschirmjäger, Hitler's elite paratroopers. At 800 hours, the first wave begins dropping from aircraft flying barely above the ground. Thousands of parachutes blossom over Cretan airfields as the largest airborne invasion in history unfolds. On the ground, 42,000 Allied troops, British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek forces, wait in defensive positions. Many are exhausted survivors of the Greek campaign, evacuated to Crete just weeks earlier with minimal equipment. They have been warned that airborne assault is coming. They are ready. What follows will be 10 days of savage fighting that nearly ends in German catastrophe. The Battle of Crete was unprecedented. Never before had an island been invaded and captured by airborne forces alone, without seaborne support. German commanders gambled that audacity, elite troops, and air superiority could overcome numerical disadvantage in hostile terrain. For several desperate days, the outcome hung by a thread. German paratroopers suffered catastrophic casualties. Allied forces came within hours of throwing the invaders back into the sea. Yet ultimately, Crete fell. The victory cost Germany so dearly that Hitler, horrified by the losses, forbade further large-scale airborne operations for the remainder of the war. The Allies, observing German success despite heavy casualties, drew opposite conclusions and massively expanded their own airborne forces. This is the story of Operation Mercury, a victory so costly it was effectively a defeat, and a defeat that taught lessons enabling future Allied victories. Following the German conquest of mainland Greece in April 1941, Crete became the last Allied foothold in the region. The large Mediterranean island, approximately 160 miles long and varying from 7 to 35 miles wide, held strategic significance far exceeding its size. Its location, equidistant from Greece, North Africa, and the Middle East, made it valuable to both sides. For the Allies, Crete offered a forward base for naval and air operations. Royal Navy ships could operate from Cretan harbors, threatening Axis supply routes to North Africa. Aircraft based on Crete could strike Romanian oil fields at Ploesti, Germany's primary petroleum source. British submarines using Cretan ports could interdict Axis shipping throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Politically, holding Crete demonstrated Allied determination after defeats in Greece and North Africa. For Germany, Crete represented both threat and opportunity. Allied possession threatened the southern flank of the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. British aircraft from Crete could attack German forces in Greece and threaten Balkan communications. Conversely, German control of Crete would secure the Balkan's southern flank, provide advanced bases for attacks on British positions in Egypt, and demonstrate German military dominance throughout the Mediterranean. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, chief of German military intelligence, opposed the operation. He warned that casualties would be enormous and that success was far from certain. General Kurt Student, commander of German airborne forces, disagreed vehemently. Student believed airborne forces could achieve what conventional invasion could not, rapid seizure of key objectives before defenders could concentrate forces. He convinced Hitler that Fallschirmjäger could capture Cretan airfields, allowing reinforcement by air-landed troops and eventual seaborne convoy. Hitler, impressed by the audacity and potential strategic gains, approved Operation Mercury. The 7th Flieger Division, Germany's premier airborne formation, would spearhead the assault. Supporting forces included the 5th Mountain Division, elite Alpine troops trained for difficult terrain. Luftwaffe units would provide overwhelming air support. The plan called for simultaneous assaults on multiple Cretan airfields, Malim, Rethymno, and Heraklion, with paratroopers seizing the fields and holding them until reinforcements arrived. Allied forces on Crete numbered approximately 42,000, but their combat effectiveness was severely compromised. The majority, 28,000 British and Commonwealth troops were survivors of the Greek campaign, evacuated without heavy weapons, vehicles, or adequate supplies. Australian and New Zealand battalions had lost most of their equipment. Artillery was scarce. Anti-aircraft guns were few. Communication equipment was limited. The remaining forces included roughly 10,000 Greek troops, mostly Cretan recruits with minimal training and antiquated weapons, and about 4,000 British troops already stationed on Crete. The defending forces lacked armor. There were no tanks. Transport was minimal. Most units relied on foot movement. Air support was virtually non-existent. The RAF had withdrawn its few remaining aircraft to Egypt, leaving Crete defenseless against Luftwaffe attacks. Major General Bernard Freyberg, the New Zealand commander appointed to lead Crete's defense, assessed his situation grimly. His forces were exhausted, under-equipped, and dispersed across the island's length. He had to defend multiple objectives, 3 airfields, 2 ports, key towns, without sufficient troops to adequately garrison any of them. His greatest advantage was intelligence. Ultra-intercepts had provided detailed information about German plans, including timing, objectives, and even unit designations. Freyberg organized his defense around the airfields, correctly identifying them as German objectives. The 5th New Zealand Brigade defended Malim Airfield on the western end of Crete. The 19th Australian Brigade garrisoned Rethymno Airfield in the center. British and Commonwealth forces held Heraklion Airfield in the east. Greek troops and additional Allied units defended Chania, the island's administrative center, and Suda Bay, its primary port. The defensive positions were well prepared. Troops dug trenches, prepared firing positions, and camouflaged themselves effectively. They understood they faced airborne assault and prepared accordingly. However, critical weaknesses remained. Communication between units was poor. The island's single coastal road made movement difficult and exposed forces to air attack. Most critically, Freyberg lacked mobile reserves to counterattack enemy breakthroughs. Cretan civilians, fiercely patriotic and hostile to German occupation, prepared to resist. Men gathered hunting rifles, shotguns, and whatever weapons they could find. Women prepared to provide food, water, and medical care to defenders. The civilian population would play a crucial role in the coming battle and pay a terrible price for their courage. The German assault began at 600 hours with a massive Luftwaffe bombardment. Bombers and Stukas attacked Allied positions around Malim, Chania, and Suda Bay. The attacks lasted 2 hours, devastating communications and suppressing defensive positions. Dust and smoke obscured visibility. The noise was overwhelming. At 800 hours, the first wave of German transport aircraft approached Malim. Flying at minimal altitude to reduce time in the air, Ju-52 transports disgorged paratroopers over designated drop zones. What followed was carnage. Allied troops, waiting in concealed positions, opened fire with rifles, machine guns, and whatever weapons they possessed. German paratroopers, helpless during descent and vulnerable immediately after landing, were shot in mid-air or cut down as they struggled with equipment. The Germans had made critical tactical errors. Drop zones were too close to defensive positions, giving defenders clear fields of fire. Paratroopers jumped from such low altitude they had insufficient time to ready weapons before landing. German weapons were dropped in separate containers, forcing paratroopers to locate them while under fire, often an impossible task. Units became scattered and disorganized. Officers were killed before they could rally their men. At Malim, the 3rd Parachute Regiment dropped directly into prepared New Zealand positions. The slaughter was immediate and comprehensive. New Zealand soldiers, many veterans of the Greek campaign, methodically shot paratroopers as they descended. German casualties in some companies exceeded 50% within minutes. The paratroopers who survived the initial landing found themselves pinned down, separated from their weapons containers, and under intense fire from concealed positions. Major General Wilhelm Sussman, commanding the German Airborne Forces Western Group, died when his glider crashed into the sea, a devastating command loss at the operation's outset. Lieutenant Colonel Bruno Breuer, assuming command of forces at Malines, found his regiment scattered, disorganized, and suffering catastrophic casualties. By midday, German forces at Malines held only precarious positions in a riverbed west of the airfield. The airfield itself remained firmly in Allied hands. At Prison Valley south of Chania, the German assault group tasked with capturing the town and Ceuta Bay dropped into a killing ground. New Zealand and Australian troops decimated the paratroopers. Major General Eugen Meindl, commanding the assault group, was severely wounded within hours. German forces, scattered across the valley floor, could not organize effective attacks. By evening, they occupied only isolated positions, surrounded by enemy forces and running low on ammunition. The afternoon brought the second wave, targeting Rethymno and Heraklion. Here, too, Allied defenders slaughtered the descending paratroopers. At Rethymno, Australian troops annihilated German units, inflicting over 40% casualties on some battalions. At Heraklion, British defenders combined with armed Cretan civilians to devastate the German assault. Paratroopers who landed in the town itself faced fierce street fighting against soldiers and civilians alike. By nightfall of May 20th, Operation Mercury teetered on the brink of catastrophic failure. German casualties exceeded 4,000, nearly a quarter of the entire assault force. Multiple senior commanders were dead or wounded. Not a single objective had been secured. Allied forces had repelled attacks everywhere, inflicting disproportionate casualties. German paratroopers, elite formations that had never known defeat, were scattered, disorganized, and fighting desperately for survival. At his headquarters in Athens, General Student contemplated his options grimly. The operation had been a disaster. If the Allies counterattacked decisively, the entire German airborne force might be destroyed or captured. Everything depended on the next 24 hours. The key to Operation Mercury's outcome lay at Malines Airfield. Without capturing at least one airfield, German forces could not be reinforced. Without reinforcement, the scattered paratroop units would eventually be overwhelmed. Malines became the battle's decisive point. During the night of May 2021, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, commanding the 22nd New Zealand Battalion defending Malines, faced an agonizing situation. His battalion had fought magnificently, repelling German assaults and inflicting heavy casualties. However, communication with higher headquarters had broken down. He had lost contact with companies on his flanks. German forces occupied positions dangerously close to the airfield. His casualties were mounting, and ammunition was running low. Andrew made a controversial decision. Unable to communicate with headquarters for orders and believing his position was untenable, he withdrew his battalion from the immediate airfield area to positions on higher ground to the east. He intended this as a tactical adjustment, maintaining defensive capability while consolidating his forces. The withdrawal was limited, approximately 1 mile, and Andrew believed he still controlled the airfield. However, the psychological impact was decisive. German forces, discovering the withdrawal at dawn, immediately occupied abandoned New Zealand positions. While they did not control the entire airfield, Allied artillery still covered the runway, and Allied forces held commanding heights overlooking the field. The Germans held positions on the airfield perimeter. General Student, grasping at any possibility of success, ordered immediate exploitation. At 800 hours on May 21st, against all tactical doctrine, Student ordered Ju-52 transports to land at Malines despite the airfield being under fire. The first aircraft approached, landed, and immediately came under artillery and machine gun fire. Several transports were hit and destroyed. Others crash-landed, but some successfully disembarked troops and supplies. More transports followed. The losses were staggering. Dozens of aircraft destroyed on the runway or while landing, but the reinforcement continued. This was the critical moment. If Allied forces had launched an immediate, powerful counterattack to retake the airfield, they could have prevented further German landings and doomed the entire invasion. Freyberg had reserves available, the 20th New Zealand Battalion and other units, but he hesitated. Intelligence warnings of German seaborne invasion, which ultra-intercepts had revealed, caused him to hold forces at the coast to repel expected amphibious landings. Communication breakdowns meant he did not fully understand the situation at Maelim. The counterattack, when finally launched on the night of May 21-22, was too little, too late, and poorly coordinated. New Zealand battalions advanced toward Maelim in darkness without adequate reconnaissance or supporting artillery. They encountered fierce resistance from German forces now reinforced and organized. The attack stalled, then collapsed. By morning, German forces firmly held Maelim, and reinforcements continued arriving despite losses. With Maelim secured, Operation Mercury's trajectory reversed. German mountain troops of the 5th Mountain Division began flying into the captured airfield. Although Allied artillery continued inflicting casualties and destroying aircraft, the flow of reinforcements became a torrent. German forces at Maelim, reinforced and resupplied, began pushing eastward along the coastal road toward Chania and Suda Bay. At Rethymno and Heraklion, isolated German paratrooper garrisons continued fighting desperately. Australian forces at Rethymno maintained their siege, preventing German breakout. At Heraklion, British and Greek forces, reinforced by armed civilians, kept German paratroopers contained within a shrinking perimeter. If the battle had been decided at these locations, the Allies would have won decisively, but Maelim's fall made these local successes irrelevant. The German seaborne convoy, a flotilla of caiques and small vessels carrying heavy weapons, vehicles, and additional mountain troops, sailed from Greece on May 21st. Royal Navy forces intercepted them that night in a devastating action. British cruisers and destroyers, operating in confined waters within range of German aircraft, annihilated the convoy. Hundreds of German soldiers drowned. Virtually no heavy equipment reached Crete. The Royal Navy's victory was complete. However, the naval success came at terrible cost. Luftwaffe attacks on the Royal Navy ships were relentless and devastating. The destroyer Juno was sunk. The cruisers Gloucester and Fiji were bombed and sunk with heavy loss of life. The battleship Warspite was damaged. The destroyer Greyhound was lost. British naval superiority in the eastern Mediterranean was maintained, but the price was staggering. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Mediterranean Fleet, recognized that continued operations in Cretan waters meant accepting unsustainable losses. On Crete, German forces advancing from Maelim made steady progress. Allied defenders lacking cohesive command structure and mobile reserves conducted fighting withdrawals. The battle for Galatas, a village near Chania, saw fierce combat on May 25th. New Zealand forces, supported by Greek troops and British tanks, the island's only armor, counterattacked and temporarily retook the village in brutal street fighting. But without reserves to exploit success, they were forced to withdraw again. By May 26th, German forces had captured Chania and were approaching Suda Bay. Allied forces, pressed from the west and unable to coordinate effective defense, began fragmenting. Freyberg, recognizing that continued resistance meant annihilation of his forces, requested permission to evacuate. Churchill, reluctantly accepting the situation, authorized withdrawal. The Royal Navy would attempt another evacuation under fire. Operation Demon had succeeded in Greece. Perhaps it could succeed again in Crete. The evacuation from Crete occurred over 4 nights, from May 28th to June 1st. Unlike Greece, where multiple ports were available, Crete offered only limited options. Heraklion Port on the north coast and Esfakia Beach on the south coast became primary evacuation points. The Royal Navy, despite heavy losses and Luftwaffe dominance, returned to Cretan waters one final time. At Heraklion, 4,000 troops were evacuated on the night of May 28-29 despite constant air attacks. At Esfakia, a small fishing village on Crete's southern coast accessible only by a narrow mountain road, thousands of Allied troops converged. They climbed down steep cliffs to reach the beach where small boats ferried them to waiting destroyers and cruisers. The operation continued for 3 nights under Luftwaffe attack. Rearguard actions were fierce and costly. Australian, New Zealand, and British units held German forces away from evacuation routes, fighting desperate delaying actions. Many rearguard troops knew they were sacrificing themselves so others could escape. At Rethymno, the Australian garrison, still besieging isolated German paratroopers and unaware of the general evacuation, fought on until June 1st before being forced to surrender. The Royal Navy paid a terrible price for its courage. The destroyers Imperial and Hereward were lost. The cruisers Orion and Dido were severely damaged with heavy casualties. Destroyers Kelly and Kashmir were sunk. The carrier Formidable was damaged. Over 2,000 Royal Navy personnel died during the Crete campaign, losses that equaled those of the evacuation from Dunkirk. By June 1st, approximately 16,500 Allied troops had been evacuated from Crete. Another 5,000 were left behind, mostly rearguard units who held positions until overwhelmed. The remainder, approximately 12,000 Allied soldiers, were killed, wounded, or captured during the 10-day battle. All equipment was lost. The evacuation had succeeded in saving substantial numbers, but the losses were devastating. Germany had conquered Crete, but the cost shocked even hardened military commanders. German casualties exceeded 6,000, nearly 25% of the invasion force. The 7th Flieger Division, Germany's premier airborne formation, was effectively destroyed as a combat unit. Of approximately 22,000 paratroopers and air-landed troops committed to the operation, over 4,000 were killed and 2,000 seriously wounded. The casualties among junior officers and NCOs were catastrophic. These were Germany's airborne elite, specially selected, extensively trained, battle-hardened veterans. Paratrooper training took months. The skills lost could not be quickly replaced. Entire companies had been annihilated. Some battalions suffered over 50% casualties. The 3rd Parachute Regiment, which dropped at Maylim on the first day, lost 112 officers and 1,856 men killed or wounded. Luftwaffe losses compounded the disaster. Over 220 aircraft were destroyed, primarily transport aircraft irreplaceable in the short term. The Ju-52 fleet, backbone of German airborne operations and crucial for logistics throughout the Wehrmacht, was decimated. Additionally, 150 experienced transport pilots were killed, a loss affecting German airlift capability for the remainder of the war. Students' airborne forces would never recover. Hitler, horrified by the casualties, reportedly told Student, "The day of the paratrooper is over." Germany conducted no further large-scale airborne operations. The Fallschirmjäger continued as elite infantry, but were never again used in their intended role. The innovative airborne doctrine that Germany had pioneered effectively died at Crete. Cretan civilians played a crucial role in the battle, fighting German forces with hunting rifles, shotguns, knives, and farm implements. Armed civilians ambushed isolated German soldiers, provided intelligence to Allied forces, and fought alongside regular troops. Women cared for wounded soldiers and carried ammunition under fire. Entire villages resisted the invasion. German forces, enraged by civilian resistance and suffering heavy casualties, responded with brutal reprisals. SS troops and paratroopers executed civilians suspected of resistance. Entire villages were burned. Men were lined up and shot. The massacre of Condamary on May 2nd saw German paratroopers execute 23 male civilians. At Kandanos, German forces destroyed the entire village and massacred its inhabitants. The reprisals continued throughout the occupation. Thousands of Cretans died in German reprisal actions. Yet resistance never ceased. Cretan guerrillas harassed German forces throughout the occupation, supplied intelligence to Allied forces, and sheltered escaped POWs. The courage of Cretan civilians became legendary. though the price they paid was terrible. While Germany drew the wrong lesson from Crete, concluding airborne operations were too costly, the Allies reached opposite conclusions. They recognized that despite heavy casualties, German airborne forces had succeeded. With better planning, adequate resources, and supporting ground operations, airborne assault could be devastating. The United States massively expanded its airborne program. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were formed and trained for eventual deployment in Europe. British airborne forces expanded from 1 brigade to 2 full divisions. Allied planners studied German mistakes at Crete: inadequate preparation, scattered drops, separation of troops from weapons, and designed their operations to avoid these errors. The D-Day landings in Normandy employed massed airborne operations based on lessons from Crete. Market Garden, despite its failure, used airborne forces on a scale that dwarfed Operation Mercury. The Rhine crossing in 1945 saw the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. All these operations applied principles derived from studying both German success and German errors at Crete. Crete also reinforced the importance of air superiority. German success depended entirely on Luftwaffe dominance. Allied forces without air cover could not maneuver effectively or receive supplies. This lesson influenced Allied strategic bombing campaigns and the desperate fight for air superiority over Europe. By 1944, when Allied airborne operations began, overwhelming air superiority had been established, a prerequisite for success. Crete's conquest secured Germany's southern flank before Operation Barbarossa. The island became a base for German operations in the Mediterranean, though less effectively than Hitler hoped. German aircraft from Crete attacked Malta and Allied shipping, but Crete never provided the strategic advantages Hitler anticipated. The delay caused by the Crete operation was more significant. Operation Mercury was planned as a quick victory, finished by late May. Instead, the battle lasted until June 1st. The casualties and aircraft losses delayed other operations. Some historians argue this contributed to delays in Barbarossa, though the evidence is debated. The Royal Navy losses in Crete significantly weakened British naval power in the Mediterranean at a critical time. The sinking of multiple cruisers and destroyers reduced fleet strength when needed elsewhere. However, the Royal Navy demonstrated it could still operate in hostile waters and conduct evacuations under extreme pressure, a capability that would prove crucial later in the war. For Greece and especially Crete, the battle marked the beginning of brutal occupation. German forces remained in Crete until May 1945, surrendering only after Germany's defeat. The occupation years saw continued resistance, reprisals, famine, and suffering. Cretan courage in 1941 became the foundation of resistance throughout the occupation. The Battle of Crete stands as one of World War II's most paradoxical engagements, a German victory so costly it effectively constituted strategic defeat. Germany conquered Crete but lost the capability to conduct further airborne operations. The Fallschirmjäger, once innovative and elite, never again fulfilled their intended purpose. The losses in trained personnel and transport aircraft proved irreplaceable. Allied defeat at Crete, conversely, provided invaluable lessons that shaped future success. Allied commanders learned what worked: airborne assault could succeed, and what didn't work: inadequate preparation, dispersed drops, insufficient supporting operations. These lessons enabled Allied victories from Normandy to the Rhine. The battle demonstrated both the potential and limitations of airborne warfare. Properly executed with adequate resources, air superiority, and supporting operations, airborne assault could achieve dramatic results. However, lightly armed paratroopers without immediate reinforcement and heavy weapons remained vulnerable. The balance between audacity and disaster was razor-thin. Crete also showcased extraordinary courage on all sides. German paratroopers demonstrated remarkable bravery, continuing to fight despite catastrophic casualties. Allied troops, exhausted and under-equipped, inflicted disproportionate losses on elite enemy forces. Cretan civilians, armed with makeshift weapons, stood against professional soldiers. The Royal Navy, accepting terrible losses, evacuated thousands under impossible conditions. General Student, whose vision drove Operation Mercury, later reflected, "Crete was the grave of the German parachutists." Hitler's prohibition on further large-scale airborne operations vindicated this assessment. Germany pioneered airborne warfare but abandoned it after Crete. The Allies, learning from German experience, perfected it. The Battle of Crete remains a study in contrasts, victory and defeat, courage and miscalculation, innovation and obsolescence. It demonstrated that military success cannot be measured solely in territory captured. Sometimes the cost of victory exceeds its value. For Germany, conquering Crete meant destroying the force that conquered it, a Pyrrhic victory in its purest form. The parachutes that filled Cretan skis on May 20, 1941 marked both the zenith and the end of German airborne operations. They carried elite troops into desperate battle, achieved remarkable success, and taught lessons that would shape the war's remainder. But they also carried soldiers into a meat grinder that consumed Germany's airborne capability. Crete was conquered, but at a price Germany could not afford to pay and would never pay again.